Hollywood in 2023 wasn't just about billion-dollar blockbusters. It was also the year some of the biggest, most hyped movies crashed and burned so hard, they left craters in studio bank accounts. We're talking massive budgets, endless marketing, A-list casts, and still, audiences just didn't show up. Which films lost so much money they made executives sweat bullets and fans shake their heads? Stick around, because these disasters will make you rethink Hollywood's golden formula. The Marvels. This was supposed to be Marvel's big win. Instead, it became their nightmare. The Marvels wasn't just another superhero flick. It was a colossal financial sinkhole. Disney threw an estimated $374 million into production and marketing, expecting an easy billion at the box office. What they got? A worldwide gross of just $206 million. Do the math, and you're looking at one of the largest recorded losses in modern Hollywood history, hovering around $237 million. How did it go so wrong? Marvel fatigue had been building for years. After a decade of unstoppable success, audiences were starting to feel like every new entry was just another cookie-cutter ride. Add in confusing tie-ins with Disney Plus shows, a rushed story, and a reliance on characters casual viewers barely knew, and you had a recipe for disaster. Fans who did show up often left unimpressed, calling it one of Marvel's weakest entries. The backlash was immediate. Critics said it looked cheap, despite its sky-high budget. Social media turned it into a meme. Even die-hard Marvel fans couldn't defend it. This wasn't just a flop. It was a cultural moment where people openly asked if the superhero era was finally ending. Disney took a bruising from Wall Street and from audiences. For a studio built on controlling the blockbuster market, watching the Marvels fizzle was almost unthinkable. It didn't just bomb. It signaled something bigger, an industry in trouble, a genre on life support. The Marvel machine, once unstoppable, suddenly looked breakable. In the end, the Marvels didn't just fail. It became the new measuring stick for what a true box office bomb looks like. And for Disney, that hurt more than the nine-figure loss. The Flash. Warner Brothers spent years hyping The Flash as their game-changing DC movie. This was supposed to reset their messy cinematic universe, bring back nostalgia with Michael Keaton as Batman, and finally give the studio a hit to rival Marvel. Instead, it became one of the most infamous flops in superhero history. With a production budget ballooning past $200 million and marketing costs pushing it even higher, Warner Brothers needed the film to rake in around $600 to $700 million to break even. But when the dust settled, The Flash limped to a worldwide gross of just $270 million. Industry analysts pegged the studio's losses at over $155 million, and some reports placed it closer to $234 million. So what happened? The movie was doomed before it even hit theaters. Scandals surrounding star Ezra Miller dominated headlines, drowning out any hype. Audiences weren't excited about yet another DC reboot, especially one tied to a universe already collapsing under its own weight. Even the return of Keaton's Batman couldn't pull enough nostalgia dollars. And let's be honest, the CGI looked unfinished, rushed, and sometimes laughable. Clips went viral not because they were impressive, but because they were embarrassing. Critics were split, fans were brutal, and Warner Brothers executives had to sit there and watch as their big swing turned into a punchline. The studio had already pinned hopes on James Gunn's new DC vision, but this flop only underlined just how bad things had gotten. Instead of sparking excitement for the future, The Flash exposed the cracks in the foundation. It showed that audiences were no longer willing to hand over money just because a movie had capes and multiverse gimmicks. For Warner Brothers, it was a disaster. For audiences, it was confirmation that the superhero bubble wasn't just shrinking, it was popping. And The Flash will forever be remembered as the movie that couldn't even outrun its own hype. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. This was supposed to be Harrison Ford's big farewell, the swan song of one of Hollywood's most legendary heroes. Instead, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny turned into a jaw-dropping money pit. Disney and Lucasfilm spent around $300 million on production, plus a marketing blitz that plastered Ford's fedora across every billboard. But audiences weren't buying it. The film scraped in about $384 million worldwide, a figure that sounds big until you stack it against the mountain of costs. Analysts pegged Disney's losses at roughly $143 million. The problem? Timing and tone. At 80 years old, Ford gave it everything he had. But critics couldn't ignore the fact that Indy looked tired. Fans weren't clamoring for another sequel, after Kingdom of the Crystal Skull already soured the franchise. And younger audiences? Many of them didn't even care. For them, Indiana Jones wasn't a cultural event. He was a relic of their parents' VHS collection. Then there was the story itself. A mix of time travel nonsense, overdone CGI, and a final act that left many scratching their heads. The nostalgia factor couldn't cover up the cracks. Even with cameos and callbacks, it felt like Hollywood desperately trying to resuscitate a corpse. Critics weren't merciless, but they weren't generous either. Reviews hovered in the meh zone, and word of mouth fizzled almost instantly. That's deadly for a tentpole designed to hold up an entire summer slate. Disney's strategy backfired. Instead of a triumphant send-off, they delivered an awkward goodbye. For fans, it was bittersweet. For Disney, it was brutal. Dial of Destiny wasn't just a flop. It was a reminder that not every franchise can be milked forever. Sometimes, history should stay in the past wish. Disney had a plan. Celebrate its 100th anniversary with a magical, animated movie that would remind everyone why Disney was king of animation. Enter Wish. On paper, it had everything: princess vibes, talking animals, catchy songs, and the ultimate Disney branding push. In reality, it turned into one of the company's most humiliating misfires. The studio dropped nearly $200 million into this film, banking on global audiences to fall head over heels. Instead, Wish grossed about $243 million worldwide. After all the marketing spend, analysts calculated losses of roughly $131 million. That's not just a flop, that's an embarrassing party favor for your own birthday celebration. The animation style, marketed as a hybrid of classic watercolor and modern CGI, came off as flat and unfinished to many. Critics said it looked like a rushed TV special, not a blockbuster. The songs? Forgettable. Disney hoped for another Let It Go moment. What they got was radio silence. And the story itself? Formulaic to the point of parody. A magical kingdom, a plucky heroine, a greedy villain. It felt like a corporate checklist, more than a heartfelt story. Audiences noticed. Families skipped it, critics panned it, and even die-hard Disney fans admitted it was lifeless. At a time when animated films like Spider-Man, Across the Spider-Verse were blowing minds with creativity, Wish looked stale. For Disney, the optics were terrible. Their centennial should have been a victory lap. Instead, they gave the world a film that screamed creative exhaustion. The movie wasn't just a financial loss. It was a symbolic one. It proved that even Disney, the studio that built the modern fairy tale, could stumble badly when relying on formulas instead of inspiration. Haunted Mansion. Disney tried twice with this one, and failed both times. Haunted Mansion was their 2023 attempt to turn the popular theme park ride into a cinematic franchise. But despite the star-studded cast, Lakeith Stanfield, Rosario Dawson, Owen Wilson, Tiffany Haddish, the film flatlined at the box office. With a budget around $150 million and marketing that pushed it through the summer, Disney expected at least $500 million. Instead, the movie pulled in only about $117 million worldwide. That translated to an estimated $117 million loss. For Disney, who already had the Marvels and Wish on their hands, this was just another brick in a wall of failure. So why didn't it work? Timing, for one. Disney bizarrely released it in July, smack in the middle of Barbie and Oppenheimer fever. By the time spooky season rolled around, audiences had already forgotten it existed. That's a marketing disaster right there. Then there's the movie itself. Critics said it was neither scary nor funny, stuck in a bland middle ground that appealed to nobody. Families weren't hooked. Horror fans rolled their eyes. And Disney adults, usually loyal to park-based movies, shrugged. Even the cast couldn't save it. The performances were fine, but the material gave them nothing to work with. Instead of charm, it felt like product placement stretched into 2 hours. And for a film based on one of the most beloved rides at Disney parks, that's criminally boring. The fallout. Another reminder that nostalgia alone doesn't sell. Haunted Mansion proved you can throw money, stars, and IP recognition at a project and still end up with a ghost of a movie. Shazam! Fury of the Gods. The first Shazam was a surprise hit, fun, light, and quirky enough to carve out a space in DC's troubled universe. The sequel, Fury of the Gods, should have built on that goodwill. Instead, it turned into one of the ugliest flops of 2023. With a budget of around $125 million and promotional costs driving that number even higher, Warner Brothers needed big returns. But the film grossed only $134 million worldwide. When all the math shook out, analysts estimated losses up to $150 million. That's catastrophic for a superhero movie that had every chance to succeed. The issues were obvious from the start. The DC Extended Universe was already crumbling, with new leadership announcing James Gunn's reboot before Shazam 2 even hit theaters. Fans knew the film was irrelevant before they even bought a ticket. Add in a weak marketing campaign and general superhero fatigue, and audiences just didn't care. The movie itself didn't help. Critics called it messy and uninspired, with humor that fell flat and action sequences that looked like leftovers from better films. Even the charm of Zachary Levi couldn't rescue it. Instead of excitement, fans felt exhausted. Worse, Warner Brothers practically buried the film in its own release schedule, sandwiched between Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. It looked like the weakest kid on the playground. By the time it limped out of theaters, Fury of the Gods had cemented itself as one of DC's lowest-grossing films ever. For Warner Brothers, it was another nail in the coffin of the Snyder-era universe. For audiences, it was proof that superhero movies were no longer a guaranteed win. Shazam went from promising underdog to embarrassing afterthought. Fast X. For 2 decades, the Fast and Furious franchise defied gravity, logic, and even box office trends. But in 2023, Fast X slammed the brakes. Universal poured nearly $340 million into production, making it one of the most expensive films ever shot. Add marketing, and you're looking at close to $500 million just to get it into theaters. The global gross? About $704 million. Sounds huge, right? Wrong. When you subtract the cuts taken by theaters and distributors, the studio ended up losing around $21 million. How does a movie that makes $750 million still lose money? Overspending. The budgets had gotten so bloated that even near-record grosses couldn't keep up. And audiences were finally losing patience with the never-ending soap opera of cars, explosions, and family speeches. Even die-hard fans admitted the formula felt tired. Critics weren't forgiving either. The film was called overstuffed, ridiculous, and exhausting, even by fast standards. Sure, Jason Momoa's flamboyant villain earned some praise, but one standout performance couldn't salvage the absurd script. Add in cliffhanger storytelling that made it feel like half a movie, and people walked away feeling cheated. Universal hoped for another billion-dollar run, but Fast X proved there's a ceiling to how much audiences will tolerate. Instead of a triumphant lap, it was a warning sign. The franchise might finally be running out of road. Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania. Marvel wanted Quantumania to kick off Phase 5 with a bang. Instead, it fizzled. The third Ant-Man film carried a massive $200 million budget, plus a marketing push that practically screamed, "This one matters." But with a worldwide gross of $476 million, the movie barely crawled into the black. By some calculations, it technically made only $88,000 in profit after a year, pocket change for a company used to billions. The bigger issue? Reputation. Critics hammered it for its sloppy CGI, dull plot, and weak humor. Jonathan Majors Kang was meant to be the terrifying new big bad of the MCU. Instead, audiences left confused, unimpressed, and in some cases, outright bored. For a movie that was supposed to set the tone for Marvel's next saga, that was catastrophic. Fans mocked the look of the quantum realm, comparing it to a bad video game. Social media roasted the film's awkward green screen sets and endless exposition. Word of mouth killed repeat business, and what should have been Marvel's springboard turned into a cement block. While Quantumania wasn't the deepest financial crater of 2023, it was arguably the most symbolically damaging. It proved that even Marvel's most reliable characters couldn't guarantee success anymore. For Disney, the tiny superhero delivered a giant problem. Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken. DreamWorks Animation has had highs like Shrek and How to Train Your Dragon. Then there was Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, one of the most forgettable animated films in years. With a budget of about $70 million, expectations weren't astronomical, but the movie still managed to underperform spectacularly. It earned only $46 million worldwide, cementing itself as a box office failure. The concept itself wasn't bad. A shy teenager discovers she's part of a legendary underwater kraken dynasty. But the execution felt generic. Critics described it as a knockoff Pixar film, with none of the heart or charm. The animation looked serviceable, but uninspired. The humor, flat. And worst of all, it was released during the same summer as Spider-Man. Across the Spider-Verse, a film so visually dazzling and emotionally resonant, it made Ruby Gillman look like a Saturday morning cartoon. Audiences didn't bite. Families skipped it. Teenagers ignored it, and animation fans barely noticed it existed. The marketing didn't help either. Trailers were confusing, posters looked cheap, and the title itself sounded clunky. Compare that to the sleek branding of Frozen or Moana, and you can see why Kraken sank fast. For DreamWorks, it was a reminder that not every animated idea deserves the big screen treatment. And for audiences, it was 2 hours they weren't willing to waste. Expendables. The Expendables franchise used to be Hollywood's go-to guilty pleasure. Aging action legends blasting their way through 2 hours of chaos. But by the time the fourth film rolled around in 2023, the magic was gone. Expendables swaggered into theaters with a hefty $100 million budget and big talk about reviving the brand. Instead, it limped to a pitiful $51 million worldwide, cementing itself as one of the year's most humiliating box office disasters. The problems started with the cast. Jason Statham and Sylvester Stallone were still on board, but the surrounding lineup felt like a B-team. The novelty of watching icons unite had worn thin, and this crew didn't have the same nostalgic spark that once drew crowds. Pair that with a recycled, paper-thin script, one that critics said wouldn't have made it out of a bargain bin 90s flick, and the movie was dead on arrival. Timing didn't help. Released in a crowded fall season, packed with bigger titles, it never stood a chance of standing out. Even die-hard action junkies barely noticed it dropped, and the international markets that once saved this series turned their backs. China, which had carried earlier entries to profitability, simply shrugged. The fallout was brutal. Lionsgate had hoped for at least enough success to justify more sequels, but the numbers told a different story. Expendables didn't just stumble, it imploded. For a film about unstoppable warriors, it ironically proved that sometimes the toughest opponent isn't a villain on screen, but an audience that simply moved on. In the end, the once mighty franchise didn't go out with a bang. It fizzled, quietly confirming that even the loudest explosions can't cover up creative exhaustion. Joyride on paper. Joyride looked like the kind of R-rated comedy Hollywood desperately needed. Raunchy, fast, unapologetically bold, and led by a fresh cast of Asian American talent. Critics even praised it for being laugh-out-loud funny and unafraid to push boundaries. But at the box office, it didn't just stumble, it face-planted. The budget was about $32 million. The worldwide gross? A sad zazat milio. That's less than some Marvel films make in a single Thursday night preview. For Lionsgate, it was a nightmare. So why didn't it click? Timing was brutal. It opened against Insidious, The Red Door, and Sound of Freedom, two films that absolutely dominated their weekends. By comparison, Joyride was invisible. Marketing didn't help either. Trailers leaned into shock humor, which turned off mainstream audiences, while the people who might have loved it never even heard about it. And then there's the genre itself. R-rated comedies haven't been reliable earners in years. Streaming has swallowed that market. Why spend money on tickets when you can get edgy laughs at home? Even with positive reviews, Joyride couldn't overcome the cultural shift. For Hollywood, this flop hurt because it showed once again that even well-reviewed comedies are a gamble in theaters. For Lionsgate, it was a painful reminder that good buzz doesn't always mean good business. And for audiences, it's probably going to find a second life on streaming. But at the box office, Joyride was a total wipeout. Argylle strutted into 2023 like it was the next great spy saga. Apple and Universal dropped a jaw-dropping $200 million into this glossy action comedy, stacked it with stars Henry Cavill, Bryce Dallas Howard, Samuel L. Jackson, and marketed it as a stylish answer to Kingsman. What they got instead was a spectacular implosion. The film opened to a weak $18 million domestically and barely crawled to $95 million worldwide. Against that towering budget, it wasn't just a flop, it was a full-blown fiasco. The hype promised a slick, twist-heavy spy romp, but audiences walked into chaos. The runtime dragged, the plot was tangled, and the tone shifted so often it felt like three different movies stapled together. Critics tore it apart for trying to parody the genre without ever landing a real punchline. By week 2, word of mouth had completely evaporated, and Argylle was already vanishing from theaters. Apple, cushioned by its tech empire, doesn't depend on box office in the same way traditional studios do. But the embarrassment was undeniable. Losing tens of millions on a film this heavily promoted showed that even streaming giants can stumble hard when they play in the theatrical arena. To make matters worse, Argylle wasn't meant to stand alone. It was supposed to kickstart a massive spy franchise, a whole cinematic universe of sequels and spin-offs. Instead, it killed the brand before it even got started. For audiences, it was yet another example of Hollywood believing star power, and sky-high budgets are substitutes for good storytelling. And for Universal and Apple, a painful reminder that style without substance doesn't equal box office gold. It just equals an expensive mess. Mission: Impossible, Dead Reckoning. Part 1. Normally, Tom Cruise equals box office gold. Coming off Top Gun, Maverick, expectations for Mission: Impossible, Dead Reckoning. Part 1 were sky high, with a production budget ballooning to $290 million and marketing costs pushing the total spend close to $400 million. Paramount was banking on a billion-dollar haul. But then, reality hit. The film grossed $567 million worldwide, impressive to most movies, but not nearly enough here. Analysts estimate Paramount lost tens of millions, and while some argue the losses were lower than Disney's disasters, this was still supposed to be one of the year's crown jewels. Instead, it ended up on the bomb list. Why? Timing again. Released right before Barbie and Oppenheimer, it got swallowed alive. The so-called Barbenheimer phenomenon sucked up all the cultural oxygen, leaving Mission: impossible looking like yesterday's news. Add in the fact that it was split into two parts, making audiences feel like they were paying for half a story, and enthusiasm just didn't hold. Critics praised the stunts and Cruise's dedication, but even that couldn't save it. For casual viewers, the seventh installment in a 27-year-old franchise just didn't feel urgent anymore. And for Paramount, the sting was brutal. They'd hoped Cruise could repeat the Maverick miracle. Instead, they got a very expensive reminder that lightning rarely strikes twice. So there you have it, 2023's biggest cinematic disasters, the movies that spent mountains of money only to vanish in a puff of smoke. From superheroes stumbling to franchises running out of gas, these films proved that no budget, no brand, and no star is bulletproof. Which one shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and tell us, do you think Hollywood will actually learn, or are we just waiting for the next bomb?